Now, I was reading Pro Football Talk this morning when the news broke out that the Dolphins and Jalen Ramsey decided to mutually part ways for the upcoming 2025 season. Now, the Dolphins have some flexibility here. They could either trade him before the draft, during the draft, or after the draft. As a matter of fact, they can wait all the way until the trade deadline before they move on from Jalen Ramsey. Obviously, Jalen Ramsey probably wants to be with a new team before then, and the Dolphins probably want to make plans for their future before then. So we'll see how this plays out. But it seems like it's more likely than not the Dolphins will try to move him before the draft so that they can possibly pick up some picks so that they can replace the talented cornerback. Now, for the Dolphins, this move doesn't really make any sense from the standpoint that Jalen Ramsey is their best defensive back. The Dolphins are already down two safeties. Jalen Ramsey is the only shutdown cornerback on the team, and without him, you're talking about possibly replacing an entire secondary in one off season. That's right, two safeties, two starting cornerbacks, and that's just to get bodies on the roster that are capable for starting an NFL team. Now, can the Dolphins do it? It'll be very difficult to replace an entire secondary. I've been watching football for a long time, and I haven't seen a situation, at least not in Miami, where the Dolphins had to replace an entire secondary. Now, the Dolphins do have 10 draft picks in the upcoming draft. It's possible that if they move on from Jalen Ramsey before the draft, they can pick up some extra picks. But for them to be able to pick four starting players in their secondary, either from this draft or from undrafted free agents where the Dolphins have had some success with, then, it's going to be hard for them to replace those guys. Jalen Ramsey himself is a Pro Bowl caliber player. He's 30 years old, so he's getting a little bit older now, and he struggled at times last season, but he is definitely the best player the Dolphins have in their secondary right now. And to lose him, it's a really big deal. Now, Chris Grier went on to say some things that sounded a bit confusing to me. Chris Grier said that the Dolphins and Jalen Ramsey decided to part ways, and it's in the best interest for both Jalen Ramsey and the best interest for the Miami Dolphins. Now, for the fans, that's probably a hard sell, right? How could Jalen Ramsey leaving the Dolphins that are down two safeties and a cornerback already? Kendall Fuller's not returning. The two safeties are gone, both Javon Holland and Jordan Poyer. So how could removing the best defensive back from your team be in the best interest for the Miami Dolphins? It just doesn't make sense. So that's probably some spin doctoring. Maybe the team doesn't want to divulge exactly what's going on behind the scenes. But on the surface, Chris Grier saying that, it really doesn't resonate with the fans. At least it didn't resonate with me. And for the Dolphins to make that kind of statement publicly, it means that there are certain things that they don't want to disclose to the public. And I mean, that's fine. Sometimes the organization has to keep certain things in house in order for it to, have the kind of relationship with the players and future players that they're not willing to air out their dirty laundry. So that's the kind of relationship that you like to maintain with your players. And you really don't want to get in their bad side publicly unless your hand is forced. And I think in this situation, whatever's going on with Jalen Ramsey, and it might not be anything bad. It could be simply that Jalen Ramsey sees this team as a team that's going backwards. And his age 30 season, he probably wants to hook up with a team that is closer to winning a championship than the Dolphins are. So looking at the landscape of the Dolphins with all the drama going on with Tyreek Hill, then you have some changes in the coaching staff, and then you have Teron Armstead leaving, Calais Campbell leaving. Maybe Jalen Ramsey is seeing the writing on the wall here that this team is probably not going to be able to compete for the Super Bowl in 2025. But the Dolphins have to understand that this is a guy who's an impactful player in their secondary, clearly the most talented person. So they probably should have found some way to make this work somehow. But Chris Grier said that this conversation that he's been having with Jalen Ramsey has been going on throughout the entire offseason. So Chris Grier made it seem as though this wasn't something that they were rushing to do. It's not something that, came down the pike recently. This had been an ongoing discussion that's been happening throughout the entire offseason. So they had time to prepare and figure out what their future is going to be like at the cornerback position going forward. Now, if the Dolphins do move on from Jalen Ramsey, and at this point, it's very likely they will, drafting a cornerback with their first round pick may not be enough to fill the needs that the Dolphins will have once they trade away Jalen Ramsey. The Dolphins need two starting caliber safeties, so they'll probably have to pick one either on day 2 or day 3 of the draft, just so they can have two competent people out there lining up on week 1. And Cam Smith is still on the team, so we'll see if he can develop into anything meaningful for the Dolphins. But at this point, it seems like the Dolphins need two players to play cornerback this season that is starting caliber, and those guys may not be on the roster right now. And we're all the way in April. Now, the Dolphins have been lucky signing undrafted free agents as cornerbacks. They've had some success in the past. So, it's a possibility they might get a guy who can contribute. But very rarely do you get a guy who's a starting caliber boundary corner as an undrafted free agent. You just don't get that often. And to expect that that can happen, you're really hoping to get really lucky in the aftermath of the draft. Now, as far as the rest of the secondary is concerned, the Dolphins still need two safeties. That problem isn't going anywhere. So we'll see if the Dolphins can fix an entire secondary in one off season. That'll be something that I've never witnessed as a Dolphin fan. And I'm sure not too many fans of other teams have witnessed this as well. So this is some really groundbreaking stuff for the Miami Dolphins. Now, the Dolphins also have to think about their roster in terms of overall roster construction. And it seems as though with the departures of some of the veteran players that they've had, we all know Calais Campbell's gone, Teron Armstead's retired, guys like Jordan Poyer wasn't expected to be back after last season. So you're seeing an exodus of some of the older players, the 30-plus players off of the roster. There's some conversations that Tyreek Hill may be traded, although Chris Grier in his press conference denied that today. So we'll see how that unfolds. But Jalen Ramsey is 30 years old, and he fits into one of those guys whose best days are probably behind him at this point. So if the Dolphins are moving on from these veteran players, it's time for them to fully embrace the youth movement, right? The Dolphins have to get some young players in here, some young blood who are hungry, who are trying to get paid, trying to get to their second contracts, trying to make their mark on the NFL. And, football's a young man's game. And too often the Dolphins had too many old players. I mean, look what happened with Odell Beckham Jr. I mean, that didn't work out for them. So those older players, especially those who battled injuries, the Dolphins should probably at this point stay clear from those type of players and fully embrace the youth movement as they look to turn the page onto 2025. And that means that Tua, Waddle, and Devon Achane are probably your three biggest players on your team right now in terms of production. And now you have to get some other guys who can complement those guys, right? So, you have a young player in Jalen Wright. You have another young wide receiver in Nick Westbrook-Akine. And, of course, you have Jonnu Smith, who had a record-breaking season for the Dolphins last season. So that might be where your offense is centered around if, in fact, the Dolphins do trade Tyreek Hill before the 2025 season. But regardless of what they do with Tyreek Hill, I think it's important that the Dolphins really embrace the youth movement, getting some young guys in there, especially on defense. You need those guys to be very competitive in how they approach the game. I made a video earlier about the pitfalls of signing guys to early contracts in order to try to save money. What you give up by saving money is you give up the opportunity to get more data points on what that player is going to be for you in the future going forward. And if it were up to me, and I know some people disagree, they think that saving money on their contracts is more important. I think that sometimes it's more prudent to take the approach where you can gather some more information on the player before you fully commit to them. And if that means having them play on the franchise tag or their fifth-year option, then so be it. Gather that information first so that you can decide if that player is going to be a player that you can build around for the future. Of all the guys they signed to contracts, whether it's Tyreek Hill, which they're having a problem now, so we don't even know if the Dolphins would have gone in a different direction with him if it wasn't for that contract they gave him last August. Then you have Jalen Ramsey, who 8 months removed from getting new money from the Dolphins, already looking to mutually part ways. And then, of course, you got the Tua contract that they gave early, even though they didn't have to. The word is that Mike McDaniel went to bat for Tua to get a new contract, but They still had the fifth year option that they could have used until they got more information. And after the 2024 season, they could have gotten the type of information they need to make a more informed decision in terms of how they were going to structure his contract and his guaranteed money into the future. So these are the pitfalls in signing guys to these early contracts. Yes, you want to keep your players happy. That's obviously important. And the Dolphins scored great points when it came to player satisfaction for the team, something that they're very proud of. So you wonder what the Dolphins had to do in order to get that high grade, right? Maybe it had to do with some of these contracts they gave the players. Maybe it has something to do with the autonomy that these players have. It seemed as though they had a lot of free reign to do things that they consequently abused, that Mike McDaniel had to approach in the offseason. So when the players are talking about the Dolphins team being soft, you have to wonder, does it have to do with the playing style? Does it have to do with the coaching style? Does it have to do with the front office? Maybe the coaches give players too much free reign, and maybe that's why they're considered to be soft. Maybe the front office buckling under pressure and caving into these agents and players that want more guaranteed money. Maybe that's part of the reason why they label soft. It's really hard to know being someone on the outside. But when you look at some of these contracts the Dolphins gave, which they really didn't have to, the front office is kind of complicit in this mentality that, yeah, you want to make your players happy, but at the same time, you have to give them fair contracts relative to their performances. And sometimes the team and the player won't always agree on what that number is, but for the organization's sake, they cannot be considered a team, or at least be thought as a team that is willing to cave under all of the players' needs. Because after a while, if Jalen Ramsey sees that, Tyreek Hill is getting new money, Tua is getting new money, Jalen Waddle is getting new money, then he's saying, hey, I'm a top player on this team. I need some new money too. So that kind of stuff can spread around your team, and the Dolphins have to do a better job managing it. I'm not saying the Dolphins should be cheap, but the Dolphins have to find a way that they can balance whether they want to commit to a guy or whether they want to gather some more information before inking them to these long-term and very expensive deals. So that's something the Dolphins have to consider going forward. And I hope that they're a little bit more conscious of it when they make deals going into the future. So that's it for this video. If you like this video, hit the like button and hit the subscribe button to get all the latest content. And leave a comment in the section below. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.